Hello, this is Seraphim, and today I have a new original story for you. A story about betrayal, hidden identities, and justice that always finds its way. They found her sitting upright in the kitchen chair, a half-finished cup of tea still warm on the table beside her. And in her lap, held against her chest like something sacred, a child's handmade card with a crooked crayon heart and the words, "Thank you, Miss Ruby," written in purple marker. The coroner said she had been dead for nearly 9 hours. The landlord said she had no family listed. But 3 days later, a lawyer walked into a small funeral home carrying a leather folder worth more than the building itself, and what he read aloud that afternoon made a pastor drop his Bible, and a little girl learn the name of the grandmother she had never been allowed to know. But to understand how a woman who waved children across a street for 20 years came to hold a secret fortune, we have to start from the beginning. Her name was Ruby Mae Calloway, and for 2 decades, she stood at the corner of Elm Street and Monroe Avenue in a small town in eastern Georgia, wearing a neon orange vest that had faded to the color of a dying sunset. She arrived every morning at 7:15, rain or shine, winter or summer, her thermos of black coffee in one hand and her stop sign in the other. The children called her Miss Ruby. The parents called her the crossing guard. Most of them never learned her last name. Ruby lived in a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat on Cypress Street. The walls smelled faintly of detergent and dryer sheets, a scent she had grown to love, the way some people love the smell of the ocean. Her apartment held a small kitchen table with 2 chairs, though only one was ever used. A framed photograph sat on the windowsill, face down. She turned it up only on Sundays. Every morning began the same way. She rose at 5:30, boiled water on the stove, and made her coffee the way her mother had taught her, strong enough to stand a spoon in with a pinch of salt to cut the bitterness. She buttered a single slice of toast and ate it standing by the window, watching the sky turn from ink to gray to gold. Then she put on her vest, her white sneakers, and walked the 11 blocks to Jefferson Elementary School. The children knew her before they knew their own teachers. Little feet in light-up shoes, tiny hands holding their mother's fingers, backpacks twice the size of the bodies carrying them. Ruby greeted every single one by name. "Morning, Tyler. Morning, baby girl. Marcus, you tell your mama I said hello. Jasmine, honey, your shoes untied." She never forgot a name. Not one. Not in 20 years. Mr. Henderson, the school janitor, once asked her how she did it. Ruby had smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners, and said softly, "When you love something, you remember it. And I love every one of these babies like they were my own." Henderson had nodded and walked away. He didn't understand until much later what those words really meant. The children loved her too. In the uncomplicated way children love things that are warm and safe and always there. They drew her pictures. They brought her flowers they had picked from their yards. They showed her loose teeth and new haircuts and scraped knees. Ruby celebrated each one like it was the most important news in the world. To a 6-year-old, being seen like that is a kind of magic. But the parents were different. The parents were in a hurry. They were on their phones, scrolling emails, shouting into Bluetooth earpieces about meetings and deadlines. They drove black SUVs and white sedans and rolled through the crosswalk without slowing. Ruby would raise her stop sign, and they would sigh through the windshield like she was the inconvenience, not the cars moving past children. She never complained. She would tip her head in greeting, smile through the glass, and wave the next group of kids across. "Y'all have a blessed day," she would call after the cars. Some drivers nodded, most did not. There was one little girl, though, who Ruby watched more carefully than the others. Her name was Amara. She had deep brown eyes, 2 long braids always tied with ribbons, and a habit of looking both ways twice before stepping off the curb. She was 7 years old, in the 2nd grade, and something about her made Ruby's chest ache every single morning. Amara was always dropped off by a woman in a silver Mercedes. The woman never got out of the car. She would reach across the passenger seat, push the door open, and say, "Go on now, hurry." Amara would climb out, adjust her backpack, and walk to the corner alone. Every morning, without fail, she would look up at Ruby and smile shyly. "Good morning, Miss Ruby." "Good morning, sugar," Ruby would answer, and her voice would catch just a little. The child never noticed, but Ruby would watch her walk across the crosswalk, her braids bouncing, her backpack too big for her small shoulders, and Ruby's hand would tighten around the stop sign until her knuckles went white. No one knew why. No one ever asked. The years rolled on, the way years do in small towns, slow and sticky like honey in January. Presidents changed. The laundromat downstairs got new machines. The school repainted its walls twice. The crosswalk Ruby stood at was repaved, the lines refreshed, the button on the pedestrian signal replaced. And still, Ruby stood there every morning, a little grayer at the temples, a little slower in the knees, but never missing a day. Then, in early spring of her 20th year, the letter came. It arrived on a Tuesday, tucked into her mailbox between a grocery flyer and an electric bill. The envelope bore the seal of the school district. Ruby opened it at her kitchen table, her reading glasses sliding down her nose. She read it once, then again, then a third time, because her mind refused to accept what her eyes were seeing. Due to ongoing budget constraints and a district-wide restructuring initiative, the position of crossing guard at Jefferson Elementary School will be eliminated, effective at the end of the current school year. We thank you for your years of service. Ruby set the letter down. She folded her hands in her lap. She looked out the kitchen window at the sky turning soft pink, and for a long moment, she did not move. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed on the street below. Somewhere in the building, a washing machine began its cycle with a slow mechanical groan. Then she got up, walked to the stove, and put the kettle on. Because what else was there to do? She did not tell anyone. There was no one to tell. She had no friends, not really, only acquaintances who nodded at her in the grocery store. She had no living siblings. Her husband, Willie, had been dead for 22 years, and her daughter, her only child, had not spoken to her in 21. That night, Ruby sat at her kitchen table and turned the photograph on the windowsill face up. It showed a young woman with Ruby's eyes and a wide, laughing mouth. She was holding a newborn baby wrapped in a yellow blanket. Ruby touched the glass with one finger, tracing the outline of the baby's face. "Well, Diane," she whispered, "I guess this is it." She blew out a slow breath and turned the photograph face down again. The next morning, she went to work as if nothing had happened. She smiled at the children. She called them by name. She raised her stop sign. Amara crossed with her usual shy smile, and Ruby said, "Morning, sugar," and tried not to let her voice crack. Word spread slowly through the school. The principal, Mrs. Fletcher, mentioned it to the PTA president, who mentioned it at a meeting held in the school library on a Thursday evening. 12 parents attended. Coffee was served in paper cups. "The district is cutting the crossing guard position," Mrs. Fletcher said. "Ruby's last day will be in 3 weeks." A woman in a pale blazer frowned. "Who's Ruby?" "The crossing guard," Mrs. Fletcher said gently. "She's been with us for 20 years. "Oh," the woman said. She looked down at her phone. "Well, the kids can just use the pedestrian signal, right?" Another parent nodded. "There's a light. They'll be fine." "I mean, it's not like she was a teacher," a man in a golf shirt added. "It's just a crosswalk." Mrs. Fletcher opened her mouth to say something, then closed it again. She had learned over many years when to save her breath. No petition was started. No letter was written to the school board. No parent stood up at the next town council meeting to protest. The matter was dropped the way a napkin is dropped at the end of a meal, without thought, without regret, without looking back. Ruby heard about the meeting from Mr. Henderson, who caught her in the school parking lot 2 days later. "They ain't fighting for you, Miss Ruby," he said quietly, his old mop in one hand. "I thought you should know." Ruby nodded slowly. She adjusted her vest. She looked down at the cracked asphalt and then back up at him with a small, tired smile. "I didn't expect them to, Mr. Henderson," she said, "but I thank you for telling me." He watched her walk away, her shoulders straight, her stop sign tucked under her arm, and something in his chest squeezed so hard he had to sit down on the curb for a minute. Back in her apartment that night, Ruby made her tea. She sat at the kitchen table and stared at the wall. She thought about Willie, dead now longer than they had been married. She thought about Diane, her beautiful, headstrong daughter, who had fallen in love with a boy from a family that drove imported cars and vacationed in places Ruby had only seen in magazines. She thought about the wedding she had not been invited to. She thought about the phone call where Diane had cried and said, "Mama, his family says it's better if you don't come. They think you'd make them uncomfortable. I'm so sorry, Mama. I'll fix this. I promise I'll fix this." Diane had never fixed it. Ruby thought about the day Diane had called her to say she was pregnant, the joy in her voice, the whispered promise that Ruby would meet the baby, that things would change, that the baby would change everything. Ruby thought about the day 6 months later, when a lawyer's letter had arrived, not from Diane, from Diane's husband's family. A cease and desist, instructions not to contact Diane, not to come near the house, not to attempt to see the child. Signed by a man whose name Ruby did not recognize, but whose signature cost more per hour than she earned in a week. She thought about the small obituary she had found in the newspaper 4 years ago. Diane Calloway Whitmore, age 36, sudden illness, survived by her husband and her daughter, Amara. Amara. Ruby had read the name and the room had tilted sideways. She had sat down hard on the kitchen floor, still holding the newspaper, and she had cried until her throat was raw and her eyes swollen shut. Her daughter was dead. Her daughter was dead, and she had not been allowed to say goodbye. Her daughter was dead, and she had a granddaughter named Amara that she had never held, never touched, never even seen. Until the first day of first grade, when a silver Mercedes pulled up to the corner of Elm and Monroe, and the little girl with 2 braids and deep brown eyes climbed out and walked toward the crosswalk where her grandmother stood in a faded orange vest. Ruby had known the moment she saw her, the way a mother knows, the way a grandmother knows, the eyes, the mouth, the tilt of the chin. She had gripped her stop sign so hard that day that her palm had bled a little, and she had smiled and said, "Morning, baby. You new here?" And Amara, shy and small, had nodded. "Yes, ma'am. My name is Amara." "That's a beautiful name, sugar," Ruby had said. Her voice had not shaken. She did not know how. A real beautiful name. For the next year and a half, every morning, Ruby had watched her granddaughter cross the street. She had memorized her laugh, the way she tucked her chin when she was shy, the days she wore ribbons and the days she did not. She had never told her. She had never been allowed to tell her. The cease and desist still sat in a drawer in Ruby's bedroom, its paper yellowing, its threat as alive as the day it was written. Her son-in-law's family had money, real money, the kind of money that hires private investigators and files lawsuits and ruins women like Ruby for sport. So Ruby stood at her corner and loved her granddaughter in silence. Now, sitting at her kitchen table with the letter from the school district, Ruby made a decision. She got up. She walked to the small desk in the corner of her bedroom. She unlocked the bottom drawer. Inside was a manila envelope, worn soft at the edges. She took it out and carried it back to the kitchen. She set it on the table and opened it. Inside were bank statements, many of them, from an account Ruby had held for 19 years at a bank 3 towns over. The balance at the top of the most recent statement read $1,412,000 and some change. Ruby looked at the number the way she had looked at the school district's letter, without surprise, without joy, just with the quiet weight of a woman who had carried a secret for a very long time. The money had come from Willie, her husband, Willie Calloway, who had worked 41 years as a porter on the old railroad line that ran from Atlanta to Birmingham. Willie, who had saved every dime. Willie, who had invested in a small piece of land outside the city because a white man at the station had told him land was the only thing God wasn't making any more of. When Willie died, that land turned out to sit on top of something valuable. Ruby had never understood the details, minerals, rights, leases. A lawyer had explained it to her once, in an office with leather chairs, and she had nodded politely and signed where he pointed. The checks had started coming a year later. Ruby had taken the first check, $52,000, and she had sat in her kitchen and cried for a long time. Not for joy, for Willie, for the life they could have had, for the trips they never took, for the house they never bought, for the grandchildren they would never hold together. Then she had dried her eyes and decided something. She decided that this money, which had come from Willie's back-breaking years of polishing brass and hauling luggage for men who never looked him in the eye, would not be spent on her. Ruby did not need it. Ruby needed her coffee in the morning and her tea at night and her walk to the school. Ruby needed her children, the ones at Jefferson Elementary, who called her Miss Ruby and brought her dandelions. So she had made a phone call. She had called the school and asked to speak to the cafeteria manager. A woman named Dolores had picked up. "I want to ask you something," Ruby had said, "and I want you to keep it between us." "All right, honey," Dolores had said. "How many children at Jefferson Elementary owe money on their lunch accounts?" There had been a long pause. Then Dolores had said in a careful voice, "A lot, Miss Ruby. More than you'd think. Some of them their mamas can't pay, so we put it on a tab. But the tab just grows. And when the tab gets too big, the kids get a cold cheese sandwich instead of a hot meal. It breaks my heart, but it's policy." "How much is the total right now?" Ruby had asked. "All the debts together?" Dolores had named a number. It was not a small number. Ruby had written it down on a napkin. "I'm going to pay it," Ruby had said. "All of it, every month, for as long as I'm able. But nobody can know it was me. Nobody. You understand?" Dolores had been quiet for a long moment. Then she had said, very softly, "Miss Ruby, are you sure?" "I'm sure." "Then God bless you, honey. God bless your soul." That had been 15 years ago. Every month since then, a cashier's check had arrived at the school office made out to the cafeteria account with no return address. Every month, Dolores had deposited it. Every month, the lunch debts of every child at Jefferson Elementary had been quietly, invisibly, anonymously erased. No child had eaten a cold cheese sandwich because they were poor. No child had been sent to the back of the line. No child had been shamed. Dolores had kept the secret. She was the only person in the world who knew. And she was retiring in June, 2 months after Ruby's last day. Ruby looked at the bank statements on her kitchen table. Then she picked up the phone and called the lawyer whose name was printed at the top. His name was Marcus Bell. He had been Willie's lawyer first and then hers for 22 years. "Mr. Bell," Ruby said when he answered, "this is Ruby Calloway. I need to change my will." "Miss Ruby," he said warmly, "of course. When would you like to come in?" "Tomorrow, if you can manage it. I don't think this should wait." He heard something in her voice. Lawyers learn to hear things like that. "I'll clear my afternoon," he said. "Thank you, Mr. Bell." She hung up the phone. She sat at her kitchen table until the sun went down. Then she went to bed, and for the first time in a long time, she slept without dreaming. The next afternoon, Ruby sat in Marcus Bell's office and told him in her slow, careful way exactly what she wanted. He wrote it all down. He asked her a few questions. He did not argue with her because he had learned a long time ago that arguing with Ruby Calloway was like arguing with a mountain. "Miss Ruby," he said at the end, "you understand that this will change that child's life." "I understand. And the family, her husband's family, they may try to contest it." "Let them try, Mr. Bell. I've waited 7 years. I can wait a little longer." He nodded. He looked down at his notes and then back up at her. His eyes were wet. He blinked hard and cleared his throat. "I'll have the documents ready for your signature on Friday," he said. "Thank you." She rose from the chair. Her knees ached a little. At the door, she paused and looked back. "Mr. Bell," she said. "Yes, ma'am?" "When the time comes, and it's going to come sooner than you think, I want you to read that will out loud, in front of everybody. I want you to read every single word. You hear me?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I hear you, Miss Ruby. I'll read every word." She nodded and walked out. The last 3 weeks of school passed the way sand passes through a closed fist, slowly, and then all at once. Ruby stood at her corner. She called the children by name. She smiled. She raised her stop sign. She told Tyler his new haircut looked sharp. She complimented Jasmine's butterfly backpack. She told Marcus to give his mama her regards. Amara crossed every morning at 7:43. Ruby watched her walk away and her chest hurt every time. The last day came on a Friday in early June. The air was thick and warm. The sky was a pale, hopeful blue. Ruby woke up at 5:30, made her coffee the way she always did, ate her slice of toast, and put on her vest. She stood in front of the small mirror by her front door and looked at herself for a long time. An old woman looked back, 68 years old, gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, kind eyes, a neon orange vest the color of a dying sunset. "Well, Willie," she said softly, "last day." She walked the 11 blocks to the school. Her feet knew the way. She did not need to think about it. A mockingbird sang from a power line. A man watering his lawn nodded at her. A stray cat watched her from beneath a parked car. At the corner of Elm and Monroe, she took her place. She set down her thermos. She raised her stop sign. The first cars began to appear. The first children began to arrive. "Morning, Tyler." "Morning, Miss Ruby." "Morning, Jasmine." "I like those butterflies." "Thank you, Miss Ruby." "Marcus, you tell your mama I said hello." "Yes, ma'am." They did not know. None of them knew. The principal had not made an announcement. The teachers had not said anything. The parents had not been informed, because the parents had not cared enough to ask. So the children crossed the street the way they always did, and Ruby greeted them the way she always did. And only her hands, tied around the red octagon of her stop sign, betrayed her. At 7:43, the silver Mercedes pulled up. The door opened. A small figure climbed out. 2 braids, a purple backpack, shiny black shoes. "Good morning, Miss Ruby," Amara said. Ruby could not speak for a moment. She swallowed. She smiled. "Morning, sugar." Amara started across the crosswalk. Then she stopped. She turned around. She reached into her backpack and pulled out something folded in half. A piece of construction paper, pink, with a crayon drawing on the front. "I made you this," Amara said shyly, holding it out. Ruby took it. Her hands were shaking. She did not trust herself to open it in front of the child. "Thank you, baby," she whispered. "My teacher said today is your last day," Amara said. "Is that true?" Ruby nodded. She could not get the words out. Amara looked at her with those deep brown eyes. Diane's eyes. Willie's mouth. Ruby's own stubborn little chin. For a second, the world held its breath. "I'm going to miss you, Miss Ruby," Amara said. And Ruby Calloway, who had not cried in front of another soul in 20 years, felt a tear slide down her cheek. She wiped it quickly with the back of her hand. "I'm going to miss you too, sugar," she said, her voice thick. "More than you will ever know." Amara smiled. Then she turned and walked across the crosswalk. Her braids bounced. Her backpack was too big for her small shoulders. Ruby watched her until she disappeared through the front doors of Jefferson Elementary. Then Ruby opened the card. On the front was a drawing of a woman in an orange vest, holding a red stop sign, with a crooked crayon heart floating above her head. Inside, in shaky purple marker, were the words, "Thank you, Miss Ruby, for keeping me safe. You are my favorite grown-up. Love, Amara." Ruby stood at the corner of Elm and Monroe, and she held that card to her chest, and the morning traffic moved past her, and no one noticed the old woman in the faded vest, crying quietly into a piece of pink construction paper. She finished her shift. She waved the last stragglers across. She waited until the bell rang and the street was empty. Then she bent down, picked up her thermos, tucked the card carefully into her jacket pocket, and began the long walk home. No one from the school came out to say goodbye. No principal, no teacher, no parent. The front doors of Jefferson Elementary stayed closed. Mr. Henderson saw her from the cafeteria window. He raised his hand. She did not see him. He lowered it slowly and turned away. That night, Ruby made her tea the way she always did. She sat at her kitchen table. She placed Amara's card in front of her, propped against the sugar bowl. She turned the photograph of Diane face up. She looked at her daughter and her granddaughter's drawing, and she smiled a small, tired smile. "I did the best I could," she whispered. She finished her tea. Her chest felt heavy, but not in a bad way. heavy the way a full harvest is heavy. She thought about going to bed. Then she thought she would sit for just a minute longer. She did not get up again. When the landlord found her the next afternoon, after 2 tenants complained about a leak in the ceiling below, she was sitting upright in the kitchen chair, her hands folded around a pink construction paper card, a small, peaceful smile on her face. The doctor said it was her heart. He said it looked like it had happened quickly. He said she had not suffered. The funeral was held on a Wednesday morning at a small chapel on the edge of town. 6 people attended. Mr. Henderson, the janitor, Dolores, the cafeteria manager, who had driven 2 hours from her sister's house in Macon, Marcus Bell, the lawyer in a dark gray suit, the landlord who felt it was the right thing to do, a woman from the apartment building across the street who had sometimes nodded at Ruby on the sidewalk, and the pastor who had never met her but had agreed to say a few words. The school sent no one. The parents sent no flowers. The children did not know. The pastor spoke kindly but briefly because he had only been given a short summary of Ruby's life. Born in Alabama, widowed young, worked as a crossing guard for 20 years, no surviving family. The chapel felt enormous around the 6 small figures in the front pew. When the pastor finished, Marcus Bell stood up. He walked to the front of the chapel. He set his leather folder on the lectern. He opened it slowly, and his hands shook just a little, because he had been Ruby Calloway's lawyer for 22 years, and he had loved her in the quiet way some people love their best clients. Before we close this service, he said, Miss Ruby asked me to read her will aloud, in full, in front of everyone present. I'm going to honor that request. Dolores looked up sharply. Mr. Henderson leaned forward. The landlord blinked. The pastor, who had been reaching for his Bible to put it back in his bag, froze with his hands still on the cover. Marcus began to read. I, Ruby May Calloway, being of sound mind and firm heart, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. First, I want it known that for the past 19 years, I have been the beneficiary of an account established from mineral rights on land purchased by my late husband, William James Calloway, in 1974. The current balance of that account, including investments and accumulated interest, is $1,412,683.47. The pastor dropped his Bible. It hit the wooden floor with a sharp crack. He did not bend to pick it up. His mouth was open. Dolores made a small sound and pressed her hand to her mouth. Mr. Henderson, the janitor, said, "Sweet Jesus." Marcus continued to read. His voice was steady, but his eyes were wet. Second, for the past 15 years, I have used this account to anonymously pay the outstanding lunch debts of every child attending Jefferson Elementary School. Every month, without fail, a cashier's check was sent to the cafeteria office. No child at that school has gone hungry or been given a cold sandwich because of an unpaid account. Not for 15 years. Only one person knew my identity, Dolores Ann Richards, the cafeteria manager. And I thank her from the bottom of my heart for keeping my secret. Dolores began to cry openly, her shoulders shaking, a handkerchief pressed to her face. Marcus kept reading. Third, I wish to record here, so that it may never again be denied, the truth of my family. I had one daughter. Her name was Diane Marie Calloway. She married a man named Richard Whitmore in 2016, against the wishes of his wealthy family, who considered me, a crossing guard, the widow of a railroad porter, unworthy of association. I was not invited to the wedding. I was not permitted to attend. After my daughter gave birth to her child in 2017, the Whitmore family served me with a legal cease and desist, forbidding me from contacting my daughter or my grandchild. My daughter died in 2021 of complications from a sudden illness. I was not permitted to attend her funeral. I was not told where she was buried until 6 months later, when a kind nurse from the hospital where she died sent me a letter. That letter is in my safe deposit box, and I leave it to Marcus Bell to deliver to the proper parties. The pastor had sunk down onto the front pew. The landlord was staring at the floor. Mr. Henderson was wiping his eyes with the sleeve of his jacket. Fourth, Marcus read, and his voice cracked here. and he had to stop and clear his throat before he could go on. My granddaughter's name is Amara Grace Whitmore. She is 7 years old. She is a student at Jefferson Elementary School. For the past year and a half, she has crossed the street at Elm and Monroe every morning under my watch. I never told her who I was. I was not permitted to, but I watched her grow, and I loved her with every breath in my body, and I want her to know, when she is old enough to understand, that her grandmother saw her every single day, and that her grandmother thought she was the most beautiful child God ever made. Dolores was sobbing now. The pastor was weeping silently, his hands clasped in his lap. Even the landlord, a man who had not cried since his own father's funeral 12 years earlier, had tears running down his cheeks. Fifth and finally, I leave the entirety of my estate, the account balance, all future mineral royalties, my personal belongings, and the photograph of my daughter that sits on my windowsill, to my granddaughter Amara Grace Whitmore, to be held in trust until her 18th birthday. I further direct that a letter, which I have written and sealed, and which Marcus Bell holds in his possession, be delivered to Amara on that same birthday. In that letter, I have told her everything, about her mother, about her grandfather Willie, about the lunch accounts, and about the woman in the orange vest who stood at the corner every morning just to see her face. Marcus stopped reading. He closed the folder gently. The chapel was completely silent, except for the sound of Dolores crying. "There is one more thing," Marcus said. His voice was very soft. "Miss Ruby asked me to do one more thing. She asked me to make sure that the reading of this will was not private. She asked me to make sure the school knew. She asked me to make sure the Whitmore family knew. And she asked me to make sure the press knew." He paused. "I sent the letters this morning." Mr. Henderson stood up slowly from the pew. He walked to the front of the chapel. He put his old weathered hand on the top of Ruby's plain wooden casket, and he bowed his head. "Miss Ruby," he said, his voice shaking, "I didn't know. I should have known. Lord, I should have known." The pastor wiped his face with a handkerchief. He picked up his Bible from the floor. He looked at the 6 people in the chapel, and at the plain wooden casket, and at the leather folder on the lectern, and then he said, very quietly, "I have been a preacher for 31 years, and I have never, in all my days, been in the presence of a woman like this one." Dolores, through her tears, whispered, "You had no idea who you were really talking to. None of them did. None of us did." The story broke 3 days later. A local reporter named Janet Ortiz received the letter Marcus had sent. She read it twice. Then she drove to Jefferson Elementary School and sat in the parking lot for an hour, trying to understand what she had just learned. Then she picked up her phone and called her editor. The article ran the following Sunday on the front page. The headline read, "The Crossing Guard Nobody Fought For." The photograph beneath it was a grainy image Janet had found in an old school yearbook. Ruby Calloway in her orange vest, smiling at a small child crossing the street, her stop sign raised against the morning sun. The article was picked up by the Associated Press on Monday. By Tuesday, it was on national news. By Wednesday, camera crews were standing outside the Whitmore family mansion, shouting questions at closed curtains. The Whitmore family, who had built their reputation on philanthropy and public image, found themselves drowning in a flood they could not stop. Their charitable foundation lost 3 of its largest donors within a week. Richard Whitmore's law firm politely suggested he take an extended leave of absence. His mother, the matriarch who had signed the cease and desist 7 years earlier, refused to leave the house, refused to take calls, refused to look at a newspaper. Parents at Jefferson Elementary began coming forward with stories, their faces red with shame. The woman in the pale blazer who had asked, "Who's Ruby?" at the PTA meeting gave a tearful interview in which she said she could not sleep at night. The man in the golf shirt who had said, "It's just a crosswalk," deleted all his social media accounts after strangers began posting old photographs of him next to photographs of Ruby. A candlelight vigil was held at the corner of Elm and Monroe. 400 people came. Someone brought a neon orange vest and draped it over the pedestrian signal. Children left flowers on the curb. One little boy, no older than 5, placed a drawing of a smiling woman in a vest and wrote in crayon, I'm sorry I never knew your name." The school board convened an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to name the crosswalk the Ruby May Calloway Memorial Crossing. A bronze plaque was ordered. The budget cuts were reversed. A new crossing guard was hired within 2 weeks, a young woman who, on her first day, wept when she put on the orange vest. But the story that mattered most was not the one in the papers. It was the one that unfolded quietly, in a mahogany-paneled office in the Whitmore family's attorney's building, where Marcus Bell sat across a long table from Richard Whitmore and 4 of the most expensive lawyers in the state. "We intend to contest the will," one of the lawyers said. His voice was smooth and cold. The testator was elderly and possibly suffering from cognitive decline. The amounts involved are significant. We are prepared to tie this up in litigation for years. Marcus Bell did not move. He did not blink. He opened his leather folder and slid a document across the table. "That is a notarized cognitive assessment from Dr. Harold Kennison, conducted 6 weeks before Miss Calloway's death. She scored perfectly. She was mentally sharp until the moment she passed. Any attempt to claim otherwise will be treated as defamation." He slid a second document across. "That is a signed affidavit from Dolores Richards, cafeteria manager at Jefferson Elementary, describing the 15 years of anonymous lunch debt payments and confirming Miss Calloway's identity as the donor. Bank records support every single cent." He slid a third document across. "That is a copy of the cease and desist your family served on Miss Calloway 7 years ago. I think a jury would be very, very interested to see it." The lawyer's smooth expression cracked just a little. Richard Whitmore's face had gone the color of old paper. "And finally," Marcus said, his voice as calm as still water, "that is a letter from Diane Calloway Whitmore, written 3 weeks before her death, addressed to her mother, which I was instructed to submit into evidence only if this will was contested. In it, your wife begs her mother's forgiveness for allowing the family to cut her off. She asks her mother to find a way, one day, to meet her daughter. She tells her mother that she loves her. She tells her mother that she was wrong and that her husband's family was wrong, and that she is trying to find the courage to fix it before it is too late. It was too late. But the letter exists." The room went so quiet that Marcus could hear the ticking of the expensive clock on the wall. Richard Whitmore put his face in his hands. "We will not contest the will," he said, his voice barely audible. "That's a wise decision," Marcus said quietly. "There is one more matter. Miss Calloway's final request. She asked that her granddaughter be allowed to know the truth. Not on her 18th birthday, but now, today, while she is still a child, while it can still matter." Richard Whitmore looked up slowly. His eyes were red. "I'll tell her," he said. "I'll tell her tonight. I would like to be present if you'll permit it." Miss Calloway wanted someone who knew her to be there when Amara heard her name for the first time. Richard Whitmore nodded. He could not speak. That evening, in a sitting room full of antique furniture and oil paintings, a small girl with 2 braids sat on a sofa next to her father and listened as he told her, in a voice broken with tears, about the woman in the orange vest at the corner of Elm and Monroe. He told her about the railroad porter named Willie, and the young woman in the photograph who had been her mother, and the cease and desist, and the lunch accounts, and the card Ruby had been holding when she died. He told her everything. Amara listened without moving. Her small hands were folded in her lap. When her father finished, she sat very still for a long moment. Then she looked up at him. "Daddy," she said, "Miss Ruby was my grandmother?" "Yes, baby. And she watched me every day?" "Every day. Every single day since I started school? Every single day." Amara nodded slowly. Her eyes filled with tears, but she did not cry. She reached up and touched one of her braids, and then she said, in the quiet, steady voice of a child who has just understood something bigger than herself, "She knew my name. On the very first day. I remember. She said it like she already knew me." "Yes, baby, she did." Amara slid off the sofa. She walked across the room to her small backpack, which was sitting on a chair by the door. She unzipped it and took out a pink folder. From the folder she pulled a crumpled piece of paper, a drawing she had been working on that week in art class. It was a picture of her mother, drawn from the one photograph she had ever been allowed to keep. She walked back to her father and held it up. "Can we put this on Miss Ruby's grave?" she asked. "I think she would want to see Mommy again." Richard Whitmore began to weep, deep and silent and shattered. Marcus Bell, sitting in the corner of the room, turned his face to the window so the child would not see him cry. 6 months later, on a Saturday morning in late autumn, a small silver Mercedes pulled up to the corner of Elm and Monroe. Amara Whitmore, 7 years old, climbed out. She was carrying a bouquet of yellow flowers. She walked to the new bronze plaque that had been installed at the base of the pedestrian signal. She read the words out loud, slowly, because she was still learning some of the bigger ones. "Ruby May Calloway Memorial Crossing. For 20 years, she kept our children safe. For 15 years, she kept them fed. For a lifetime, she loved them in silence." Amara laid the flowers at the base of the plaque. Then she stood there for a long moment, looking across the crosswalk toward the front doors of Jefferson Elementary, where children's laughter drifted out into the crisp fall air. She reached into her pocket. She took out a folded piece of pink construction paper, the same card she had given Ruby on that last morning. Her father had found it in the little apartment above the laundromat and brought it home to her. Now she unfolded it carefully, smoothing the creases with her small hands, and she read what she had written in shaky purple marker so long ago. "Thank you, Miss Ruby, for keeping me safe. You are my favorite grown-up. Love, Amara." Then, beneath it, in neater, older handwriting, because 6 months is a long time when you are 7, she had added a new line. "I know who you are now. You are my grandmother. I love you forever." She placed the card gently against the base of the plaque, tucked under the bouquet so the wind would not take it. She stood up. She looked once more at the crosswalk, at the empty corner where a woman in a faded orange vest had stood every morning for 20 years. And she whispered the words that Ruby had whispered to her every single day. "Morning, sugar." Then she took her father's hand and walked back to the car. Above the laundromat on Cypress Street, in a small apartment that had been emptied and cleaned and rented to someone new, a single photograph had been taken down from a windowsill and placed in a silver frame on a mantelpiece in a large house on the other side of town. A young woman with laughing eyes held a newborn baby wrapped in a yellow blanket. Beside it, in a matching frame, was a grainy school yearbook photograph of an old woman in a neon orange vest, smiling at a child crossing a street. And in a vault at a bank 3 towns over, a trust account bearing the name Amara Grace Whitmore waited patiently, earning its quiet interest, ready for the day a young woman would turn 18 and open a letter from a grandmother she had finally been allowed to know. The crosswalk at Elm and Monroe is still there. A new crossing guard stands there every morning. She wears a neon orange vest. She has learned all the children's names because the woman who trained her told her on her very first day, "You remember their names. You remember every single one. That's how you love them." That's how Miss Ruby did it. And every morning, as the children cross the street with their backpacks too big for their small shoulders, they pass a small bronze plaque at the base of the pedestrian signal. Most of them are too young to read all the words, but they know the name. Their parents have made sure they know the name. Ruby May Calloway, the woman who kept them safe, the woman who kept them fed, the woman who loved them in silence. And somewhere, in a quiet place beyond the reach of cease and desist letters and wealthy in-laws and the cruelty of people who forget the names of those who stand in the rain to protect their children, a woman in a faded orange vest is walking hand in hand with her daughter at last. And the morning is warm, and the coffee is strong, and there is no more waiting, and no more silence, and no more loving from across a street. Just a grandmother and a mother and a promise kept. And in the little apartment above the laundromat, long after the lights had gone out for the last time, the scent of detergent and dryer sheets lingered in the empty rooms like a benediction. The smell of clean things, the smell of a life spent caring for others, the smell of Ruby May Calloway, who stood at a corner for 20 years and was never, not for one single morning, just a crossing guard. Thank you for staying with me until the end. If the story meant something to you, please support the channel with a like.